Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar by the OSU Research Commons. My name is Dessi Kirilova, and I'm the Senior Curation Specialist at the Qualitative Data Repository, of which OSU is an institutional member. And I'll talk towards the end of the presentation about what that means, but that's a big reason why I'm invited to deliver this presentation. So the topic is managing and sharing qualitative data more broadly, but then also with the specific potential venue for sharing being QDR, because repositories do things a little bit differently. Different forms of data sharing may lead you to kind of make different choices, but I will talk from the perspective of our repository. So I will start with a little presentation about what QDR is in case you have not encountered that acronym or that institution before. Then kind of how one can think about qualitative data sharing, which is still a very new approach or a very new practice, I should say, amongst people who use qualitative data. Then I'll give you some examples of currently published projects that can illustrate for you kind of maybe certain things that you can think about when you're contemplating your own potential data sharing. So that's the plan. And then, and towards the end, I'll explain the particular relationship and what it means for OSU to be currently an institutional member of QDR. And I will do my best to leave a bit of time at the end for any questions that you might have. So, 1 second. We just practiced this. Okay, what is QDR? It is a specialized digital data repository, which has been online for more than a decade now, since 2014. This is the address. It is primarily NSF funded. I should have mentioned there, we've over the years had different smaller supporting grants from various other foundations, but primarily it is kind of a big piece of infrastructure that the NSF has decided is worth supporting so that qualitative researchers have a specialized, dedicated place that curates, stores, preserves, publishes, and enables the download of digital data generated through qualitative and multi-method research in the social sciences. That's really our mission, actually. It says in the social sciences, and this is very much still mostly whom we serve, but we interpret that phrase very, very broadly. So we have a lot of researchers from public health, education, information science, wherever there's an element of kind of a socially relevant question that researchers are pursuing, and they're using qualitative or multi-method approaches with a strong qualitative component. We are certainly a good fit for any of those projects. It's headquartered at Syracuse. That's kind of coincidental. So people sometimes think we're a Syracuse University repository. That is not the case. We serve a very broad audience across the US and across the world. There's no expectation about where people who want to deposit data or use the data in our catalog are based. We're truly international and interdisciplinary at this point. But we have over 210 projects published. We've lately been able to pick up the pace with various curation improvements that lead us to do our part faster. But I should tell you that on the back end, with things that are not yet published, we have about 4 times as many as this. So we have about 800 other projects in motion. Now, the reason why it takes a while sometimes to publish a project has a lot to do with where in the research process a potential depositor contacts us, and we're really trying to promote and emphasize early planning for data sharing, which sometimes can take the form of creating a kind of a placeholder deposit, which would be counted amongst those 800 that I'm talking about, long before the data are even collected. And those of you who are researchers who've engaged in data collection, especially qualitative data collection, understand the data collection piece takes a long time. But we do want people to come and contact us early on so that we can discuss together with them what their eventual data sharing plans might be, what their needs might be, and we can help them design their project in a way that would facilitate that eventual sharing. And that's, if you are left with one message from this webinar, it's that if you are a person doing research who is contemplating the potential eventual sharing, doesn't matter how far into the future that is for any given project, start speaking to someone, whether it's at OSU, and I will mention again the information that Jared said, who are the people locally that you can consult, or whether you reach out to QDR or another repository that may be more relevant to you. Start that conversation early so that you have a much easier path along the way of your research. We have 35 institutional members. People can come and deposit without institutional membership affiliation. There's sort of different ways in which the project's curation fees get covered with institutional members. That's one of the main benefits. And since the beginning, QDR has been continuously core trust seal certified, which might not mean a lot to an individual researcher, but it is basically within our industry of information science and digital repositories, the seal of approval that the repository is doing things right, essentially. We have a wide variety of qualitative materials, as you can imagine, and I just wanted to give a brief flavor here, although you will see more in the specific projects that I also show you later. This is from a video collection that somebody collected presidential campaign videos from across multiple Latin American countries in the 90s. This is a digitized collection of JFK's pre-presidential diaries, and some of you might have questions about copyright. I'm happy to discuss that later, but in both of those cases, either the data collector obtained copyright permissions, as in the case of the videos, or the source of the original archival source of the JFK materials themselves were in the process of digitizing materials, and they wanted broader audience, so they also gave permission for that kind of archiving. There's what sometimes may be considered kind of gray data, things like administrative statistics, or somebody found these things in like a municipal authority somewhere, I think in Mexico. Those are some examples. And then what we call the bread and butter of qualitative research, which is focus group or individual interview transcripts. And that's kind of the example in the middle, which is the vast majority of what people deposit with us. But I wanted to give you a sense of the wide variety of forms and formats that qualitative data can exist in and that we can archive. Very briefly here, I don't think this is news probably to anybody who has decided to join this call, but just to recap, amongst the federal funders, with the NSF and NIH being the largest, there has been an expectation for data management, certainly, and data sharing when appropriate in various forms. For the NSF, which is really where most social science is funded from, the requirement for a data management plan to accompany submissions has been in place since 2011. However, for the first, I would say, 10 years or so, it was not very widely understood. It was not very widely implemented. Anecdotally, we're hearing and seeing more and more that program officers are insistent on A, reading it and making sure that it makes sense, but B, that wherever possible, the data sharing is actually the plan, not just saying, okay, I'm going to have these data, manage them in this certain way, but not share them. That is less and less acceptable, and in certain programs, we've discovered is completely not acceptable at this point. However, it still remains the case that within the NSF context, there seems to be currently still little accountability for the implementation of the data management plan, I would say. Although many people, many researchers spurred by the things that they put in their data management plan actually end up doing them, thankfully. In the NIH space, it's a little bit different. They've also had a data management and sharing policy for a while, but they really strengthened, clarified, and put in a lot of resources for implementing it in 2023. So the so-called new, now no longer so new, DMSP requirement, so data management and sharing policy requirement, expects that mandatorily data management and sharing plan will be included in the grant submission. The default expectation is that most data, potentially all data from a project will be shared unless some special exceptions are justified. Then there's the expectation that there will be specific plan and budget for the managing of the data during the course of the project. They have also thought, the NIH also thought about the possibility of updating the plan, which is possible within interim and final grant reports, because they recognize that in research, things sometimes change, and that needs to be reflected in the plan for the data management. And then the implementation of data management and sharing promises made in the original plan is checked and becomes a consideration for future support. Those things are very explicitly stated. So as you can hear, kind of a stronger commitment and maybe focus there. Now, in addition to the fact that funders are expecting this, what are some other reasons why we promote data sharing and, think that it's important, and it's important for researchers to kind of understand the whys on their own. So the NIH's own justification is, excerpted there, and it goes from magnifying kind of the effect of the resources that the funders spend to just broadly believing that the possibility of data being reused by others actually feeds into increased knowledge, increased collaboration amongst scholars, increased, if you will, possibility of learning from prior work, all the things that we really think that science in general should do, right? So the data sharing component enhances everything that science, all the goals that science has in general. Again, outside of the NIH world, those big picture reasons hold, but there's also kind of more specific ways to think about that. So when data are shared, they can be, again, depending on the form and the specific version of the data that are shared, they can be reanalyzed by secondary researchers. That could lead to collaborations, which is actually one very strong motivation for many people to want to share their data and make them more accessible to others. Data sharing also allows transparency for specific publications. So maybe somebody has chosen not to share their whole full collection yet, but a portion of it that they analyze for a given publication that they are planning. In this case, again, depending on exactly what they share, there may be the possibility of replication. We don't like that phrase specifically with qualitative research, but with quantitative, you can see the applicability. Verification, traceability of methodological choices, just making the published product, the published work, more understandable to others. I think that's a goal that all of us, regardless of methodological approach, can agree is beneficial. Then teaching and training, and I'll give some examples of how that could work with shared qualitative data, and even motivations such as giving back to the participants and communities that we research. We've been hearing that from various from the depositors of various projects, where they actually want special access for the people whom they interviewed, because they promised them that they would give those kind of not just the results, the summarized results, but those raw transcripts back to the community in that form. So that's one element of giving back to participants. The other element is a little bit more indirect, but it is, if data is shared from a particular community that is of interest to social science, let's say, or to a given discipline, not over-researching the same community can become its own indirect benefit. People could go back to these originally shared data and find the answers to other questions instead of going back to, again, requesting time and attention and so on from the original participants. So I want to give you some very real life illustrations of all these three examples of potential reuse. So this is reuse in practice, secondary reanalysis. One of the projects published on QDR comes from a researcher named Corey Steimer from the University of Maryland School of Social Work. It is actually, interestingly, a restricted project, and I'll talk more about and give examples of what that means, because it included interviews with vulnerable populations and kind of discussing very sensitive topics, namely the people interviewed were women exiting prostitution diversion programs. So you can imagine the sensitivity of those types of data, but both the researcher had done a wonderful job, A, getting permission by the people that she interviewed to share the data, B, de-identifying the data, and C, obviously worked with us to apply appropriate restrictions. Somebody who qualified for access under the restriction terms decided to reanalyze them with a completely different research question in mind, and was able to write this master's thesis. And now on the basis of this, the person, Marina Hamdan, has continued on to do her doctoral work. So this intellectual product would not have been possible had the original data not been shared by the original researcher. Here is developing and contrasting methodologies. So this is a project by Jessica Lester and co-authors, who gathered a group. They're methodologists, so people who study how we do social science, how we, for example, in this case, analyze qualitative materials from different methodological angles. So they gathered a group of about 10 people who all reanalyzed one shared deposit in QDR from the perspective of their particular chosen, method. And then they discussed in this methodological piece how their specific take on the same data kind of led to different insights or had, touch points that were similar with other approaches and then differences and so on. So that was kind of an interesting project that they just approached QDR to let us know about. Otherwise, we had nothing to do with it, but they found the data that was appropriate for reanalysis by different methodologists in our catalog as well. And then the pedagogical or teaching possibilities with shared data are also tremendous. This is something that when QDR was originally created was a big focus and interest of ours because, as again, you may know from either your own methodological training or if you are yourselves instructors of research methods, quantitative data for pedagogical purposes are widely used. It's often the case that when students are trained in quantitative analysis techniques, they're given actual data or, cleaned up, but started out as actual data so that they can analyze them and, learn the approach. This is very rare. Until recently, pretty much was impossible with real, authentic qualitative data. But now that people do share with permission for pedagogical reuse, this has become much more common. This is one person who was one of the earliest instructors who contacted QDR to ask for permission to do this and our advice how to do it properly. He has done it now over 10 years. This is somebody based at the UK university. But since then, we've grown the ones that we know about, I should say, because sometimes people might do this without our knowledge necessarily, still following all the rules that are spelled out in the terms and conditions. But we know of at least 25 instances of instructors who have been able to use qualitative materials for their own classes that where they train graduate and sometimes undergraduate students in qualitative research. So these are all amazing potential, secondary reuses. But to take it back to kind of the bigger picture reasons and motivations that I hope you can agree with at least some of these, sharing data, including sharing qualitative data, allows you to be a good colleague, a good researcher in the researcher community, because others then can build on and learn from your work. You then indirectly become a good teacher. Students benefit from working with real data that way. A good citizen in the broad sense of kind of a research community citizen, because open science, of which sharing data is one practice, open science is more impactful science. It allows you obviously to get funded and published when data sharing is a specific expectations by funders or publishers. Research has shown that a lot of actually empirical evidence across different disciplines has shown that publications whose data are shared end up getting more visibility and attention. And it allows you really to be a better researcher yourself. My assumption is that you're all great researchers. You want to learn more about how to do what you do even better. When you, in the back of your mind, are expecting the secondary audience that comes with shared qualitative data, you just tend to plan ahead better, document and organize the materials better, and things that otherwise you just be carrying in your head become more explicit and clear in the presentation of the findings. So that allows you to show the rigor of your work in a different, new way, in addition to just the published articles that we're more used to. But then how do we do all that, especially when it comes to qualitative data, right? So I, here in this presentation, can't talk about very specific cases and maybe the questions that you have for your own data. For that, I would advise you either to have a consultation on your campus with Research Commons folks and the research librarian at OSU, or contact us if QDR seems like a place that your data eventually might find a good home at. But more generally, we have to keep several things in mind. We have to think about data sharing early on. I already emphasized that, but I couldn't emphasize it enough. And holistically, right? The data creation is a big part of a research project. It's not just something we have to get through in order to like get the publication out. This is what your whole actual research and findings and conclusions are based on. Then we have to consider issues of data security and access, both during the project and after, right? If there's going to be the data sharing component. All of that should lead us to plan and organize early on. We should set up our folder name, file names, structure if we have, let's say, multiple sites or different types of participants that we're interviewing. All of that can be planned for in advance before you actually start the data collection itself. And then creating documentation throughout the project. So writing things down as they happen. That's the best form of documentation, because doing things after the fact, we forget it, we don't have the time to go back, and so on. So this is the how. Start planning early, stick with the plan, document the steps that you've taken according to the plan. That's basically the takeaway from how. Where should we share data? Now, I've already clearly made an argument for sharing via a repository and via an appropriate repository. There are many repositories. Again, I don't want you to actually think that QDR is the only option, although it is the only option for qualitative data that is based in the US at least. But the recommendation to share data in a repository is a very strong one at this point. Other forms of more informal or less structured data sharing have been superseded by the functionalities that repositories offer. And what are these functionalities? So when you share data in a repository, you are provided with stable links to the project, in QDR's case also to individual files, but to the project as a whole. So a DOI, a digital object identifier, becomes part of your deposit citation. Repositories promise long-term digital preservation, something that no individual researcher should be burdened with after the end of their project. They should move on to other substantive work and leave the digital preservation, the technological aspect of that, with professional repositories. Repositories allow you to meet institutional requirements. They provide the curated ones anyway, not all are curated, but QDR is a fully curated repository. So they provide data management planning and curation assistance customized to your project. So it can help you share your data well, not just share them by throwing them up somewhere in a disorganized, poorly named, and so on form. Repositories, because of the indexing functions that they perform, allow more visibility for the data for others to discover, access, and cite. They allow, when data need to be restricted, things like access controls, embargoes, and so on. And again, I'll show you an example of that in just a little bit. So overall, all of these technological and procedural facilities that repositories provide lead to so-called FAIR data. And FAIR is an acronym that you may or again may not have heard of, but it's the goal of data sharing for data to be shared in a fair way so that they become findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So that is what a repository provides you with. So some examples, I kept saying I'll show you an example of this and an example of that, but here we go. Some examples, all from QDR. Oh, and I should say, I actually I always make the effort when I talk to institutional members to show examples from amongst their colleagues. So I looked up, and we currently have 3 projects published by OSU affiliates. Some of this first one, as you can see here, it's a large kind of collaborative team. All of them are Ohio State University affiliates. The other 2, one was a dissertation work. The person was at the time a graduate student at Ohio State, has since then found a job somewhere else, so no longer an OSU affiliate, but is recognized as an OSU depositor at the time. And then the third one, again, was a team. One person has moved on. The other people are still your colleagues. So this is an example of, again, kind of the most typical and standard type of deposit that you would see. It contains interviews, interview transcripts that look like that. The project, I should mention, is on the implementation of mindfulness in motion for firefighters and emergency medical service providers. So the interviews are there, de-identified, as you may be able to see. Basically, there's no names. It just identifies each participant as FR and then the number, FR for firefighter, I think, or first responder, because there are different types. Then there's documentation of the codes used. So a code book was shared. And again, that's where we help people think about, depositors think about, in addition to the data, what other pieces that you've already created, right? We don't ask them for anything that new to create, but what pieces that you've already created would provide that additional facility for a secondary reuser to make sense of your data. So in this case, the code book was obviously a helpful documentation file. And these are all shared under what we call standard access conditions, which basically require a person to create a secondary user to create an account on QDR and agree to our general terms and conditions of use. And those are things that just remind the potential reuser of good research data practices. Things like they're not going to intentionally try to re-identify de-identified people. They're not going to create extra copies that they disseminate to others who have not agreed to the terms and conditions of use. And if they use the data in any future publications, they're going to cite, as you see here, there's a specific citation with the DOI. They're going to cite the source, the data source. So that's typical standard access conditions. You will see in a minute more restrictive ones that go beyond that, but this is what project like this looks like. Oh, and I wanted to mention this was published, I should say, fall of last year. I forget exactly, but let's say October. Within a month, we had a request for somebody to use this for pedagogical purposes, and so since then it's been used at least for that that we know of. Again, just within a month. So that's always exciting to see and know about the reuse of one's deposited materials. Here's another example where we get to see some of the more the graduated kind of restrictions that could be applied when necessary and well justified. So this is a project, as I said, by a team where Dr. Castellan, I believe, is still at OSU, but Mobulaji Bitoye, who was the first author and primary data collector, has since changed affiliations. But their project is from the health sciences, as you see. The topic is demand for modern contraception in sub-Saharan Africa, new methods, new evidence. And it's a very, very rich project. They deposited the whole collection, of which on the basis of which there are many publications that have come out and still in the works. So you see here their rich documentation. So you can see their original informed consent, characteristics of their large interview sample, the guide, or in other words, the interview questionnaire for the 3 different types of interviews that they conducted. And then the interviews themselves are in these folders. So they had cognitive interviews with dozens of people, in-depth interviews. There's a reason why they separate those two, again, with dozens of people, and then joint interviews with couples, which is relevant for this topic. Now, what you can also see is that here's, an attempt to open one of the files, one of the cognitive interviews. The CI stands for cognitive interviews. And you see that a person who may try to do that currently would see this note. The files are unavailable during the specified embargo. And actually, there's another place you can click and see when the embargo ends. And then after that, they're restricted access. So this was because they actually, in their case, were not required by their funded. I think they were funded by the Gates Foundation, and it was not a requirement to share the data, but they thought it was a good idea nonetheless, for all the various reasons that I listed before. And they just wanted to finish all their planned publications that already were in motion before they released the data in full. Now, that is not the type of justification that the NIH would approve of. Again, they have very special actually requirements on the timeline on which data need to be shared. But in this case, it was not in contravention with the funder requirements. So there's still some time before this embargo expires. And then the data are restricted basically to researchers who can provide a research plan explaining how these types of data fit in their research question and topic, which is a very common type of restriction. Okay. Now here's one. This is the dissertation work that I told you about. It's from a few years ago, and it's super interesting because it's an example of mixed methods qualitative data project. So it's based on archival materials from, as you can see here, the Dominican Republic, and I think Haiti. Yeah, I was going to say there was another country in the Caribbean. So the Dominican Republic and Haiti. The topic is exposure to trade and post-colonial divergence on the island of Hispaniola. So you can imagine, again, the interesting kind of research design that this person took one location, but ended up being 2 different countries, and kind of how they approach different things in their early economic development. So this depository included a wide variety of historical materials that he had collected. There's statistics, there are maps, of which this is an example, newspaper articles of the time, and so on, organized very neatly within the 2 sites, the folders for each of the sites, and then within that, each site had the same types of materials. So just very rich mixed method data. All right, now, as you can, I want to wrap up so that we leave enough time for questions, but I did want to highlight specifically, because I'm sure those of you who work in the qualitative tradition may have this big concern. How do I do this when I'm talking to people, when I'm potentially talking to people about sensitive topics? You saw some of the examples, but just to highlight now, kind of in a little more theoretical level, what are the pieces that you need to make sure are part of your research design that do not impede the eventual sharing of data on the one hand, but that also ensure that the sharing is appropriate and well thought out on the other. So the ethical concerns that always accompany human participant research are the same. Research needs to be designed and undertaken to ensure the confidentiality of your respondents, to ensure that whatever commitments you take towards them, you meet. Harm to participants must be avoided in all instances, including thinking about, is there any potential harm that data sharing or the specific form of data sharing might bring? And participation of people in your research needs to be informed. Those are general ethical concerns that we all try to think about and address when conducting human participant research. So the data sharing piece just means that you also have to think about that potential use of the data, right? It's not just what happens with my interaction with the researcher in the course of the data collection, but then also what happens eventually if I am planning to share the materials that I collect with their help in some form. The connection between institutional review boards, which that their review is required for all human subjects research based on federal regulations, as you know, and what is covered in a data management and sharing plan is actually very strong, but it's not always well recognized. It's not always well recognized by the IRBs themselves, and even less so, I would say, by researchers. The challenge is that while IRBs, have their forms and protocols and things that they ask you to present to them for review, they don't necessarily ask you to present your data management and sharing plan. So it's really a little bit on the researcher to ensure that the 2 documents, which really cover a lot of the same material, that they align well. And why am I saying this? It may seem very obvious, like, of course they should align well. It's about the same project. Yes. However, we have had numerous cases of people coming to us wanting to deposit their data after the project was completed for one reason or another. And the first thing we ask them is, can we see the informed consent script under which you collected these materials? And in the informed consent script, it says things like, only the researcher will ever see these data. So that tells you that people did not at the time recognize that the data sharing plan and the ethical commitments that they undertook actually intersect and should have aligned. So that's why I want to drive this point home for those of you who are embarking on new projects going forward. Again, as we said, research always needs to be informed for human participants. And what that means in the context of data sharing is telling people that you are planning to share the data in form X or Y or Z, and allowing them to agree with that if they agree. In qualitative research, it's actually a very good approach to make the consent to data sharing optional. So here's an example, again, from a real project where the informed consent had this additional statement at the end of everything else that normally would be in an informed consent script. It said, if you agree, the transcript of your interview may be shared with researchers at other organizations in the future. We will take out or change any information that could identify you before sharing. So in other words, the researchers were undertaking the commitment to de-identify the data before sharing. And you can be in the study whether you agree to data sharing or not. And then there was a yes. Now, with this consent, with this optional consent for data sharing, in a project that was about abortion experiences, again, as you can imagine, a very sensitive topic about personal experiences, 92% of the respondents opted into data sharing. And that's, again, been documented across different research projects, different disciplines, people generally, if they agree to participate in the research, they also want their data to be made the maximum possible use of under the right conditions. So I don't want you to be entering your project or you're contemplating your interaction with your participants thinking that that would be something that scares most people. No, if you explain what you're planning to do, if you listen to their response and take it into account and comply with it, obviously, most people are going to be happy to participate in data sharing as well. Then the next step would be, if necessary, again, that's not always the case, but in many cases, if necessary, and if you've taken that commitment, de-identifying the qualitative data before sharing them. And there's kind of good practices about that. I'm not going to go into the details of this slide. By the way, I should have mentioned, the slides are going to be shared with all of you who registered, so you'll be able to see the additional details that I'm going over more quickly here. There's examples that you can, again, learn from in the shared data on QDR's catalog. There's one example that is by far the most downloaded single document, which is a de-identification protocol. So this particular group of researchers explained in very explicit terms how they approached de-identification, so you can learn from them. And then again, if necessary and justifiable, choosing an access restriction, as some of the examples that I showed you before. We at QDR like this saying, and this is kind of our starting point, shared data should be as open as possible, as closed as necessary, and where that line lies will differ not just from project to project, which obviously that's part of the calculation, but even within a project from participant type to participant type. So you can imagine, let's give one example. In the health context, often there will be three types of participants. There will be the patients, there will be the care providers, and let's say there will be the family caretakers if it's somebody with some kind of medical condition. Those three types of people have different vulnerabilities and different kind of potential consequences of their data being shared. So they don't necessarily need to be under the same level. Their data doesn't need to be under the same level of restriction. So it could be varied, in this very customized, tailored way, even within a project. But some examples that you already saw are the timed embargo. Again, this is not, I gave you kind of an atypical case where it was a publication-based consideration, but these other ones, and more typically timed embargoes for human participant protection reasons, are done on the basis of, okay, at which point would my current concerns about sharing these data not be the case anymore? And it could be, soon or not so soon. Then access by application. Again, this is the actually most typical restricted level that we apply. So identity and affiliation checks of the potential secondary reuser. Then there could be additional specific requirements. For example, some depositors feel better knowing, or QDR confirming that the reusers have CITI or other human participant protection training. Secondary IRB could be a justifiable requirement, although typically only for data that still contain personally identifiable information. De-identified data really no longer fall under the purview of IRB, so this is not an appropriate restriction if the data are going to be de-identified, just to kind of clarify something that we've also found is sometimes confusing. All right, now very quickly, the specific benefits of QDR as a repository to which OSU has institutional membership. We provide, for a certain number of slots that the membership covers each year, free curation and storage for typical size qualitative and multi-method projects. Affiliates of institutional member organizations get priority data management and sharing consultations. We still, again, advise that you don't wait until the last minute before your grant application is due, but approach us if data sharing would be part of your plan. Approach us as you're starting a project so we can help you refine that part of the mission. We are recommended by and compliant with federal private funders. We provide strategies and tools for sensitive data in particular. Again, this is our expertise and the thing that distinguishes QDR from other existing data repositories. And we also, our staff is available for virtual class visits. So something similar to what we did now, but less with an overview of QDR and more with discussion of, how do we de-identify, like in the context of such and such work, what are the things to look out for, and so on. So any of you who may be methods instructors, something to keep in mind as a possibility. Here is your local liaison office, so to speak. And also some other links, if you are not aware of them, of people and places on your campus that can help you with consultations at different points in the project lifecycle. Now, this here is what we on QDR's end promise. I'm pretty sure that your friendly local research data librarians would be happy to also advise with ideas for any of those points as well. But I am speaking for them here, so please take that into account. But basically, when planning your research is the best time to seek that kind of expertise. But then when depositing your data, we can continue talking about the disclosure risk review that QDR curators conduct on the identified data that are sent to us. Consultation on data organization and documentation, if that was not well in place from the beginning. Any data file transformations that might be necessary, we do all of that at that late point. And what it looks like is you can create an account, log in, click on this big plus sign that says new project, and start a placeholder. As I said, we actually truly recommend that very early in your process. A placeholder where you're asked for very few required fields. The title of your project, you as the creator would show up there because you're logged in. You'd also show up as contact, and then a very brief free text description of any kind that you want. That, again, if you're at this early stage, you'd say, I am planning a deposit eventually. Here's where I am. Here's my topic. Could I set up a consultation? This is as simple as it can be. If you're at the later stage and you already have your data, you could go on and just add the files and so on, and we can still have the consultation at that point. But the recommendation is to do it as early as possible. So I will pause here. This is all of our contact information, and I will count on my hosts to help us have a conversation with any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dessi. I'm going to go ahead and it looks like we've got about 14 minutes left in our time. So we can go ahead and take questions. You can do that by putting them in the Q&A at the bottom, and I'll moderate from there, or you can put them into the chat. As we do that, I'm also just going to go ahead and put in the chat our standard follow-up for all of our Research Commons events. This just gives you a link to take you to our post-event survey that allows you to share information about the event today, share your opinions, and we get that back to the presenter, as well as use that in-house to make our events a little better. And also you can see, just reiterating, our public site link at the bottom, as well as the access to our LinkedIn. We encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn if you don't already. All right, and with that, let's take some questions. Dessi, we've got a comment in there, just no question at the moment, but wow, so informative and helpful. Thank you so much for the great information. And
that's how we try to be informative and helpful.
Kristen has dropped a direct link to QDR here for Ohio State, a library Ohio State link. So if you're internal to us, there's a link for you. We've got a question here. Can we find any data about work from home or remote working?
Sorry. We do, sorry, I don't know that at this point, because our catalog is growing. I used to know every single project off the top of my head. I know there's something about working during COVID. I don't remember if it specifically had to do with remote working, but the best way to find out if the kinds of data or the kinds of topics you're interested in are covered by the currently published deposits is to go to the catalog and search. The search, interface is very intuitive. You should just use whatever keywords that you'd normally use, and it would bring things up if there is something published. Again, I can remember for sure one deposit that had to do with work conditions during COVID, but I don't remember the specific questions that the original depositors asked. Sorry.
Okay, we've got another question here. You mentioned that there are a select few slots for OSU researchers. Do these slots typically fill up quickly from year to year? How early should my investigators reach out?
So the investigator should reach out as early as possible for a different reason, not whether they'll have a slot that's covered or not, but so that we can advise in the best way to collect and organize the data, before you actually, ideally before you start data collection. Otherwise, I actually there's 3 tiers which institutional members can choose from. And I right now don't remember what OS uses, but also it may change from year to year. Typically, we have enough slots for each institutional member. I would say that. I do want to highlight, though, often, and this is more of a discussion that you may have with your, with people at Research Commons or with Kelsey Badger, who's the research data librarian. Often universities like to use those slots for unfunded dissertation type work where the resources are, the lowest. There's not a formal exception, better funded, let's say, work can also qualify under those slots. It's not really been an issue. It's only I would say in the past 3 years that we're getting even close to the slots being filled by most institutional member organizations. So I don't think that you should be so concerned about not getting a slot, but I still, like I said, recommend that your researchers reach out early in their own projects. I don't know if this is a person who's like the head of a lab or something. It's hard for me to imagine without further context, but early in the research project is when I advise you to consult with us.
Still open for questions if you have them.
I also went super fast so that I leave more time here, but if people don't have specific questions, but they want to maybe go back to something that I said or an example that I gave, I'm happy to do that.
We'll give it a couple of minutes here just in case anyone's typing. Yeah, you can feel free. I'm fielding both the Q&A section and the chat, so wherever it's easiest and most comfortable for you to put your question, go right ahead. And we've got a question. Can we deposit any data published in foreign languages?
That's a great question. Oops, sorry. I don't know why I keep getting out of my slides. That's a great question, and I should have talked about this, maybe given an example. Absolutely. So there is no expectation that the data will be in any specific language, right? Especially with qualitative data. They come from the site and the context that you conduct your research in. For many researchers who may be bilingual, trilingual, and so on, they don't necessarily, for their own purposes, translate things into English, and that's fine. The only thing that will work with you to create and provide in English would be the documentation. And by that, I mean both metadata elements. So for example, keywords, so that people who come to our catalog, that is all set up in English. So we presume people will be searching in English. So we want to make sure that the materials are documented and have the appropriate keywords in English. And also documentation files. So something like what we call a data narrative that basically describes how the data were collected. That would be in English as well. But aside from that, the data themselves can be in whatever language they were originally collected in.
Not a question, Dessi, but just another participant who has just said thank you very much. An amazing presentation and very pleased for the quality of the presentation today. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Still open for questions.
Is it okay while people were thinking maybe I asked something and I don't know what's, they can type, I can see. So maybe how many of you are currently planning a research project, I guess? I'm just more curious where people who've chosen to attend the webinar, where they are in their research life cycle journey. So how many are planning at the moment a new research project?
Let me go ahead
Yes, or
and
me or something like that.
yeah, well, I can actually allow, if you raise your hands on this, I can go ahead and allow you to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and open up. There's one person that I'm going to open up their ability to talk.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dessi, for the excellent presentation, and Jared for hosting. I was just raising my hand to answer your question, but yes, I am in the planning stages. I actually am in, I do lead a research group, and so I'm in all the stages at the moment, including with data that could potentially be deposited, but is like fully collected and, not cleanly de-identified, and so would need lots of work, including me checking what we said on the consent form before I actually do anything about it. So yeah, but also applying for new grants that would generate the kind of data that you were saying we would do a consultation about early on. So thanks again. I actually I put this in the review form, but I will also say that I'm sure you already know this, but just in case, the protections that can be put on the data in QDA are much more flexible than I was expecting. And I hadn't really realized until I heard you talk how much I was a little bit biased against doing this kind of data sharing, because I was assuming that those levels of protections would be much more rigid. So, hearing all that detail from you about all the ways in which it's not rigid was super helpful. Thanks.
Well, I'm glad to hear. And again, if you just allow me to take your concern and kind of talk about it a little bit more. Yes, people often think that data sharing is all or nothing. Like, I'm putting my data out there and it's all open. Anybody clicks and reads everything. And QDR specifically was set up in a way that is very attuned to the concerns of qualitative researchers who work with human participants. I do want to say, our whole staff from the beginning, and everybody who's currently on the staff, we are all social scientists who do human participant research in various, on various topics and in various contexts. So we're very aware of these concerns, while at the same time still very much sold on the idea of how beneficial data sharing is to science. So we've tried to come up with rules that are based on good data sharing practices and, like I said, attuned to the concerns of qualitative researchers, so we can meet in the middle and find the best solution for any one project. As I said, I'm glad that you heard in what I'm saying, the level of customization that could be applied. So something I hope that all of you will, take comfort in, that you can find the best solution for the particular concerns and kinds of considerations that you have with your research, with your participants. Sorry. So thank you for saying that made you feel more comfortable. I'm glad to hear.
I've got another question here. Says, you may have answered this, but if there are multiple data sources you want to use on one topic, are you allowed to combine them?
Different data sources, if to the degree I'm picturing this, absolutely. So the example that I gave of let me see if I can go back to it quickly, of the historical, historical economic development was different sources, right? So it just comes down to making sure that you describe the sources, you have permission from them if that's a concern. But again, we work with you to figure that out and request permission, so on, if it's an existing archive, for example. So describe the sources from which different pieces of the data came, and organize them in a way that's then easy for somebody to follow, like here. So this is from the Central Bank of the Dominican Republic. This is from certain statistics books, which are described in the documentation file better, maps, and so on. So absolutely, different data sources are what makes, qualitative data projects so rich. It's just a matter of describing them properly and explaining where everything came from, so that any secondary user can follow that process that you undertook, if that makes sense.
Great. We've got one more question in the chat here. Is there any data available regarding management history?
Again, I'm sorry, I cannot tell you about any one topic that you may be interested in, but please feel free to go to qdr.org and just search our catalog and see if you can find something.
Great. We'll go ahead and do a final call here, about another 30 seconds or so. If you have any final questions, now is the time, because we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.